Hello and good morning to everyone, and welcome on today's webinar of the ODA Learning Series 2021. My name is Eva Lacinova, and I will be a moderator of today's session. And before we will immerse ourselves into the topic, let me share some basic rules. So please do not forget to be muted when you are not speaking. Write your questions in the chat box. We will explore them and discuss during the Q&A part at the end. And please switch on the cameras. We would like to see you and we would like to create a little bit of in-person feeling. Great. So our team has been organizing these capacity building workshops since 2014. And when the pandemic hits, we have switched to online form. Our thanks goes to OECD and other strategical partners for co-organizing during these new normal settings. And many thanks to you all who joins the webinar on a regular basis. Today, we will focus on results-based financing. The landscape of global development finance has changed significantly, and the donors started to look beyond the traditional models and gradually support new financing instruments and approaches like impact bonds and other pay for success mechanisms. And these instruments could not be understood as a new way of working and engaging some groups or new methods in particular sectors. They should be understood as a new way of doing things, new way of tackling the problems, or we can even say as a new business model. So let me introduce our speakers and give you overview of the topics they will focus on. As the landscape of instrument is wide, and the fact that they could be specific animals, we will have a proper introduction to the topic by Peter Nicholas and Toby Eklas. They are both from Social Finance, not-for-profit organization from UK. Peter is Director of Social Finance and he has over 25 years of management and project experience, mostly from World Bank. And Toby is founder and development director of Social Finance, who has led teams and also personally prepared projects in the US, India, South Africa, or Brazil. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for giving us the introduction into the topic. Afterwards, Elina Jarvela and Vahagan Voskanian will show us how to establish successful social impact bonds, and they will share their hands-on experience from Armenia. Elina works as a strategic designer at the UNDP Istanbul Regional Hub, and Vahagan is Impact Investor Advisor from the UNDP Country Office in Armenia. And at the last, but not the least, we will focus on social impact incentives as a specific mechanism which rewards high impact enterprises with time-limited premium payments for achieving goals. Patricia currently works for Roots of Impact, and she has been affiliated in the past with several organizations. Let me name United Nations Industrial Development Organization among them. And as already said, our sessions are organized by our strategical partners. And the lead of today's webinar has been done by Slovakia. So I would like to give a floor to Tatiana Zhilkova, team leader of Unit for Development Cooperation from Ministry of Finance. She will explain to us why and how Slovakia supports innovation and impact financing in their ODA. As you can see, she is taking the lead here instead of colleague who is not able to attend. So Tanya, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Eva, for introduction, and I would like to thank everyone for finding time to participate at this event. I hope it will be really useful and bringing new ideas, knowledge, and exchange to all of us. So I'm stepping in for our head of Department of International Institutions and Financial Instruments, who is unfortunately was not able to make it today. He's also taking part of the trying to solve the crisis that is happening everywhere around us. So I will step in for him, and I'll try to be brief. So thanks again for UNDP and OECD to organize this event. We are trying to participate in creating and exchanging creating opportunities for exchanging know-how between the partners, donors, practitioners, and everyone who is interested in new trends and developments in the development cooperation and in solving complex issues that we are facing. The Slovak Ministry of Finance has been partnering with UNDP and OECD on these learning sessions since, as far as I can remember, since 2018, and we are trying to focus on innovation in delivering development assistance, and trying to find ways how to more effectively deliver public services using new technologies, innovations in finance, and so on. As we have seen also in the last 1.5 to 2 years, the problems in the society are becoming very, very complex, and we find it increasingly difficult to deal with it with simple solutions. And addressing them requires alignment between different actors, and this is why we have also focused our development cooperation on finding ways to join sectors, join the best of all worlds, to try to promote innovation in public service and in delivery of public service to the citizens. It helps us to keep pace within the changing circumstances, and also basically meet expectations of the citizens, and also build trust, which I think is really important, especially in the view of the recent developments in this field. So in the framework of Slovak Development Cooperation, we are trying to focus on innovation also because as a very small country with a very limited ODA budget, we are trying to look for ways how to make our support available in places where it may be lacking. That's why a couple of years back, we have decided to support innovation team within the Istanbul Regional Hub, which is dedicated to providing support to partners and to country offices of UNDP around especially Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Since then, they have been piloting and experimenting with a number of innovative mechanisms, innovative projects. And our hope is that our seed funding would then, help leverage, first of all, pilot and experiment, and then leverage and mobilize more additional funding to those projects that are the most promising or more effective in delivering, development and socioeconomic development, inclusion, and so on, and good governance. And so some of these innovations included impact finance. I'm very happy that we'll hear today about one of the flagship initiatives done by the Innovation UNDP team, which is supporting country office in Armenia to develop basically UNDP's very first Armenia dairy impact bond. And I'm really happy that we are going to be talking about it, because it's a very kind of new and not very explored area. And of course, it has its challenges, and there might be advantages, but also limits to the impact or result-based financing. So I'm very, very glad that we'll have a chance to also hear a little bit of a theory and see also how the things have been handled in practice. I will stop here, and I would like to thank again UNDP and especially Eva for organizing. This is already a pleasure to be involved in putting together such an interesting program, and I'm looking forward to interesting presentations and discussions. And thank you very much, everyone who has found time to participate.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for such a brilliant, introduction. And I'm glad to see you here. And I'm also glad to see colleagues from Slovakia, from Ministry of Finance from Slovakia, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would like to, said that if you are all here, it will be great also for the participants to ask you questions. So really, please do not hesitate to put your questions in the chat box when we have colleagues from aid here in Slovakia. And right now, we will focus, on the topic itself. And I'm going to hand over to Peter and Tobe to give us the overview of the tools and of the general idea here. So Peter, welcome. It's glad to have you here, and over to you.
Great, thank you, and thank you to Tatiana for that excellent introduction. I'm actually going to hand over to my colleague Toby to make our presentation, but we'll both be available for questions during the discussion time. Thanks, over to you, Toby.
Brilliant, thanks, Peter. Okay, and just in terms of what social finance has been doing in this, just so you're aware, rather than advertising break, I guess we've sat in the center of trying to build impact bonds since the first one in the UK in 2010. So we've been looking at where these are applicable, where they make a difference, and how to bring the different parties together to make these kinds of structures work and have impact in a whole host of different environments and countries. So without further ado, we will look at the first slide, if we may, the case for outcome-based finance. So really, outcome-based models are doing something specific, which is tying the funding directly to success. And if outcomes aren't achieved, payments aren't made. And you might think, wow, that puts a lot of risk to people. It makes things more difficult. But actually, strengthening the link between funding and impact does tend to build a market for more effective and efficient programs. But it also means that the program providers are freed up to learn and adapt and change what they're doing so that they can focus more effectively on the results. So these are particularly valuable when you have circumstances where, when the program starts, there are either some uncertainties about what balance of programming is needed, or where you expect that there are later linkages as you sort of try to work out how to make something really make a difference. You know that you're going to need to learn and adapt on the ground. And this obviously differs quite a lot from an input-based designed log frame model where everything needs to be designed and developed up front and then followed very carefully according to that design initially. And we've seen this in a host of environments, whether it's trying to make sure you get education outcomes in India, where program providers, when they therefore did spot checks and testing on children's learning, were finding out which parts of the training they'd done for teachers had been effective and which hadn't, and adapted accordingly. Or whether it's when you're working across a supply chain, as we're going to hear more about in Armenia, the sort of potential for dairy farmers, if you are going to improve the economic circumstances of smallholder farmers, there are quite a few different parts that need to work, but you're not quite sure which one you're going to need to focus most effort on. And at that point, an outcome-based model where everyone is incentivized to figure out where the challenge and blockage is and work through it becomes a really important part of making success happen. So it incentivizes that more adaptive service provision, and it does bring in a real requirement for rigorous measurement alongside the adaptation, which again, for more complex programs, can be crucial to their success. If we can have the next slide, please. So this really comes in two varieties, if you like. Traditional results-based financing mechanisms, where service providers are paid in arrears when pre-agreed outputs or outcomes are achieved. And this model is quite widely used, and one of its challenges is that that puts the working capital or the risk capital challenge back to the service provider. And we'll talk about some of the limitations that can be successful, but we'll talk about some of the limitations that can create. And then impact bonds are really an extension of this, but where at the beginning, the financing for that working capital is found from an outside party. And we've found that by bringing an external investor in or investors in, they're also bringing with them the expertise they have in the private sector of expecting to adapt and change programs along the way, or entities they've funded along the way. So there is an expectation of capturing data. There's an expectation of using that to improve what's happening. And so bringing that external expertise can be crucial to bringing that culture change into the program development itself. These come in a variety of flavors. We started off calling things social impact bonds because they were being funded by the government at the time in the UK. We started referring to development impact bonds when the funding came from an outcome funder or a development partner as an external donor. And that does make a difference because you still have to make sure that things are locked into or engaged with local partner government solutions, and outcomes are co-developed also with partner governments. And then humanitarian impact bonds, where the objective is more is in the humanitarian space. I'll also touch briefly on, if you like, the next extension in some ways from impact bonds, which is where one thinks about pooling outcome funds and producing, if you like, trying to shape or work across a market rather than just with individual suppliers on an individual project. So I will go through each of those in a little bit more detail now. And if we could move to the next slide, thank you so much. So the simplest form here of outcomes finance is the traditional results-based finance approach. It can produce some challenges. It doesn't always, so it's worth reflecting on. But the first piece is you are restricting yourself to service providers that can access the working capital, that can fund things themselves. So it can work quite well, for example, if the implementation is through government public service systems, that might work. But it's going to be restrictive if you're wanting to bring in smaller or more dynamic or more different service providers, because they won't be able to afford to bid or to participate. It also means that there is no straightforward access for those service providers into the adaptive qualities that are needed to work really well with outcome funding. It's not brought in intentionally as part of the process. And if it's just left with them, then we have sometimes found that, if you like, their optimism that an input process works then gets in the way, because they've worked with a lot of input-based models before. They implement the process they thought of at the beginning, and then when they're finding it, they don't work as well as they had expected when it comes to measuring outputs and outcomes. They haven't got the culture of adaptation built into the processes and workings that they've got in their organization. And then, of course, that reaches the next criticality of this, and that is that the wish to protect NGOs and smaller organizations from the consequences of not succeeding means that there is a temptation at the beginning to start making outcomes that you would have measured more into outputs closer to inputs, lower risk, and therefore one actually reduces the risk and reduces the adaptability of the whole process in order to avoid that. And so you can end up in some circumstances with something that looks actually much more like a traditional input-based model. So if you're needing that adaptation and innovation, then you can squash it out sometimes with a results-based finance model. Okay, So if we then look at impact bonds, thank you, perfect timing, on where they are supported by risk capital. The project financing is provided by the investors who take the risk of the project failing on delivering agreed results. Therefore, if you like, there is an incentive between the investors, or the incentive between investors and achieving the outcomes that you're looking for and the impacts that you're looking for are well aligned. In this model, the modalities, whilst you may develop a very careful plan at the beginning, and everyone wants to make sure that that plan is carefully thought through, outcome donors do not actually specify the implementation modalities. And so that enables, from a contractual point of view, an expectation of flexibility and change, rather than, if you like, a lot of change mechanisms and bureaucracy required if anyone wants to change anything. And then the investors support the service providers in managing implementation and managing adaptation. And very often there is a performance manager or impact bond manager that provides technical assistance to the service provider in terms of implementing the data capture and technology, so that they have got effective analysis of results, of indicators, of process. And so there is a monthly, 2-monthly review of data, understanding what's happening and adapting accordingly. And finally, it means that outcomes and outputs are independently verified to make sure that everyone's comfortable, but that also makes for a really rigorous process. Thank you very much. So this does help to address the drawbacks of traditional RBF models. It provides the risk capital as mentioned to allow people to bear the risk of loss. By bringing in a performance manager, it brings in, if you like, that culture of adaptation and change. And actually, I think one of the things we have seen with a number of these programs is, if you're working in an area where there are a number of different things that have to work well, and I think we'll hear more about it, the theory certainly with the Armenia dairy impact bond, that when you look at the situation where you are trying to improve the economics of smallholder farmers, there are a number of different elements that need to work. You're looking at animal welfare, but you're also wanting to make sure that downstream, those who are taking the milk in are actually going to test whether the milk quality is high, that they're going to get a higher price for higher quality milk. So there's a number of different bits in the chain that need to work. And so actually, these kinds of programs can provide learning for a much wider system in terms of what is needed and what isn't needed and what works and what doesn't, because you're introducing so much more rigor in terms of how the program is managed right the way through the chain. So freeing the outcome funders to embrace innovation, it also means that you don't need to be quite as concerned taking forward something that looks higher risk, because you are in a position to say, we are paying for this when it works. And so there isn't necessarily, the checks and balances are allowing for that greater risk to take place. Going through, thank you very much. So one of the challenges mentioned on impact bonds is that they are, there's quite a lot of technical expertise required to pull them together. And with individual impact bonds, the uncertainty of whether one is going to end up making outcome payments can be difficult in terms of internal accounting systems. Are you going to make payments or not? Are you going to use up your budget or not? Now, an outcomes fund is in some ways a response to some of those challenges. So by pooling development finance to fund payments for successful RBF or impact bond models, you are, if you like, creating a center of expertise to do a range of these kinds of structures in a particular area. They've usually got a sectoral focus, which means that the expertise of pricing outcomes, understanding which interventions are helping, bringing together the data from a range of impact bonds or RBF instruments so that one is able to learn across the system and provide technical assistance across the system, can enable more consistent success and a lower cost of transactions in terms of implementing these kinds of models. So, pardon me. It also means that you have competition because you have something which has got a longer period. So more entities engaged, they know it's worthwhile. They'll find out whether they're successful in one project, and therefore that gives them a ability to understand and continue into other projects, while others, if they haven't been so successful, may fall away. So it provides a very positive impact-oriented competition, where those that are more successful in generating outcomes are more successful for the longer term. And this therefore also allows, I guess, with an outcomes fund, and there's an example of this is an education outcomes fund focused on the Middle East and Africa, with starting projects in Ghana and Sierra Leone. There's a range of different potential education interventions into very low resource settings. And so it's a route to testing and learning across that system and across that specific sectoral expertise. Okay. So if we can just go through, because then of course, if you have outcomes funds, then just one back, thank you so much. There is also, and what we're seeing emerging now, one is being run by UBS, which is finalizing it, is an outcomes investment fund. So this is an investment fund which specializes in financing high quality impact bonds and outcome-based instruments. And I think this is also a very constructive addition to the marketplace, because it means you have investors who are used to understanding the risks in an outcome-based contract, because they're very different from other investment risks. They're able to actually often bring expertise because they've looked at a whole array of these kinds of structures. And it means that in terms of reducing the transaction costs and the time to market for these kinds of structures, it can bring the investor part of the equation in much more quickly. Typically, investment funds in this area need to be set up with a focus on both social and financial returns, and they need to be focused on not purely market-based returns, but they need to demonstrate their sort of social value focus, because in the end, supporting outcome-based contracts needs to be driven by a strong social mission and focus on the impact, as well as in getting one's funding back. Okay, and then the last slide before we go forward into others. So what are the roles of development partners and donors, or donors in this innovative finance? I mean, clearly providing outcome funding, but there's also the opportunity to initiate and support the design of these kinds of instruments. And these kinds of instruments, I think, are ones that we have seen having an impact on the wider system or that style of work, because they are implemented in this very different, more rigorous, more measured, more adaptive way. So there's a role for emerging donors to play a transformatory role. And there is, I think, by supporting these kinds of projects, there's an opportunity of magnifying the impact of financing through working in this more pioneering fashion. I think there was a question that came through on the chat, but I didn't quite see what it was. COVID and its like, and what does it mean for risk mitigation? How can you protect both investors and service providers and reduce the risks of failure? So if I just touch on that briefly before, is that the right idea? Shall I touch on that?
Maybe Toby, we can leave it at the end, because also some of the
Some of the
ideas
others will have
will
a
pop
view.
up during the session. So
Completely agree. Okay. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you ever so much.
okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this, amazing introduction. And you described the theory, completely comprehensively, and you already did some practical links. But I have to say, like, knowing your personal experience and knowledge, from different countries, from fragile states, from low-income countries, I have to really ask you, like, could you give us, example of a social impact bond from your portfolio, or maybe from portfolio of the others, who you think was really like a role model, or something as a best example, which we should focus on and not to forget if we wanted to really understand the social impact bonds.
It's sort of like picking a favorite child, isn't it? I
Yeah,
think
something like, if someone will be completely new and
Yeah.
wanted to see, like, this is, you should aim for, this was the best example.
Yeah, I think I think the work that Peter led actually in the West Bank is a really interesting one, because there we were looking at employment outcomes in the West Bank in Palestine. So really a very difficult area of work, and we wanted to make sure that the work, the employment work, typically in the form of inputs on training and so on, is an area with a huge array of relatively unsuccessful projects. And so, slightly blunt way of putting it, and therefore really linking this to employers, to payments being made for people being sustained in employment for 6 months, which at that point, crucially, they become an employee with a lot more rights and so on in Palestine. And therefore that the whole program would only be successful if it were thought from a sector by sector approach. It talked to employers about what they really needed from training. It linked up with employers before then finding suitable people and suitable training to make that difference, to bring people into new forms of work. It's that kind of thing which I think is really exciting, because you see an area where there's huge need, where present intervention models are research and evidence-wise really poor. I should be more diplomatic than that. Have challenges, and where a model where you are thinking across the overall system can make a big difference. So I think it's an example where, and you see others getting really interested in those kinds of employment models, and they may not do them as impact bonds, but it's really showing a different way of working.
Yeah, thank you. And I can even imagine you need to really focus on different things when you are establishing this, and you really enjoy when it's developing well. And this is somehow even linked with the social impact bond in Armenia, which will be presented right now, because the colleagues really will show us what you need to really do if you are thinking about the social impact bond. So what really particularly needs to be connected, what you need to observe. And we will right now from Elina and Vahagan, we will get the lessons learned and the reality from the field. So this is perfectly connected, and I'm handing over to Elina, so over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks a lot. Happy to be here and share a bit of our experiences. Are you all seeing the slide?
No, we are not, unfortunately, not me.
Yes, I'm expecting somebody from your team to share the slide. Perfect. Sorry, there is one slide. This is not the one? There is an overview, one slide about the impact bond journey.
Yeah, colleagues are finding that, and before we will have the slide. Elina, I know that you have a wide experience with different tools. What you will say about the social impact bonds? What is the biggest advantage you can see under this tool?
Well, I think the biggest one is about it's really bringing different actors together. So there is really it's like my colleague Vahagan, who will talk after this. He's really saying, because it's not a traditional bond, but he's using the word bonding. So it's really bringing different actors together under pushing towards the effectiveness, towards the impact and outcomes. So it's really a clever way of bringing different organizations and people together to work towards the impact together. So that's at least my experience, and I will just give you a very brief overview of our journey, which has taken around 5 years since we have been exploring the outcome-based financing. We have been, like Tatiana said, we have been supported by the Ministry of Finance of Slovakia, exploring a different type of alternative finance mechanism. And really one of that was outcome-based financing and impact bonds. When we started in 2006, we had one country in Serbia where we started exploring this, pick a youth employment as a topic there to explore and start building also our knowledge around it. What does it mean for UNDP? What could be our role? What could be our partner's role? And there was a lot of exploration, also bringing different type of partners together, the government partners, the marketing there around the service providers. So a lot of capability building happened there. At the same time, we started establishing partnerships. You can see I put, for example, Sitra Finnish Innovation Fund that has been with us from the start, who is really an intermediary in Finland who has designed several impact bonds in Finland. So we acknowledge that there's a lot of expertise globally. So we wanted to bring different partners to work together with us so we can utilize also their expertise and advice on how to move forward. With that one example in Serbia, we understood that this type of thinking, not just only the mechanism of impact bond, but also the outcome-based approach is really useful also for us to start shifting the way we finance development, but also the way we finance how we use public finance in our countries. So that's why we launched a year-long SIP design program with 5 other countries in our region, covering Montenegro, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and North Macedonia. So that was a year-long process where we started with really hands-on design week in Finland with several partners like Sitra, but also others like EIB, EIF as investor points of view, bringing fund managers such as Epicus, ministries, so sharing different experiences from other countries, and also service providers to help us think about what could be those social topics that we really scope under each of these impact bonds in these 5 countries. That was really a kickoff that started that country-specific feasibility analysis and capability building. So a lot of they're happening around data collection, evidence building, what could be those implementation modalities that could play a role in these countries, what is really the framing for it, what type of topics are suitable, and what is really the impact that we are looking for under these. So there was a lot of work, and at the same time awareness raising, building the market so that the service providers know about that they get to know the outcome-based financing approach, what is it about, working with ministries, their people, that they also know about it, but at the same time doing legal analysis in these countries. Can we make it happen in these countries? Are there any legal barriers that we should take into account? So there was a lot of exploration and working with different partners, which ended in training in Slovakia, for example, around the regulatory environment for SIPs that we did together with Government Outcomes Lab. It was really useful because many of these countries really identify in their own legal analysis that there are no really barriers, but how do we make this happen? What are really the procurements if we work with host governments? So if it's really a steps that those host governments are paying for outcomes, how can we make it happen? Who is procuring what, and what are the roles and responsibilities and contracts? So it was really useful for us to work with those who have been looking into that. At the same time, you can see maybe below, we started establishing learning exchange with others who are doing this. For example, with EIB Advisory Platform for Social Outcomes Contracting. It's really a group of EU countries who are doing this. Another, we were part of the working group of impact bonds. Social finance was leading as a secretary also there. It was a group of more on a different type of experts, but also a lot of donors angle to understand what's their role. And at the end of this process, we established a partnership with EBRD, and that partnership has now led to the launch of the structuring process with EBRD and Peter's team from Social Finance UK, where we are structuring the Armenia Dairy Impact Bond. At the end of this, so there has been a lot of learnings. So now we are putting a bit of a digital manual together around this, so we can really put our learnings there. So a few words just about, so we started looking at this because we wanted to kind of understand, can we diversify, align development partnership, build development financing, and build new partnerships, but also, of course, to drive that effectiveness so we can achieve more outcomes and impact. But then also to understand, if we do this under development umbrella, what are the implications for public finance? And I want to kind of say a few things that, okay, we have blueprints, we have experiences from other countries, but we understood that localization is always needed. Because of that localization, we need to invest time for learning, building those awareness in those countries, collecting data, building evidence, understanding different incentives and motivations of different partners. And then also move away from that short-term thinking. Because of the nature of these development challenges that are usually suitable for this, because if there's something very simple, we can just, maybe we don't need the impact bond structure for it. But really, because of the nature of it, we need a bit of time to build also the trust around this new way of working. Some of the service providers, for example, in these countries stated that if there is a government, host governments paying for the outcomes, we need to make sure that they will pay for the outcomes even after, let's say, 5 years when the outcomes are achieved. So there is a bit of a trust building, market building, awareness raising, and that doesn't happen over one night. And I think donors can play a real role in this, that we can also divide that, for example, the first pilots using the impact bond can be, the outcomes are paid by donors. So those are those development impact bonds, which can really then bring those experiences that it's doable in this country, it works, and then we can move more on that social impact bond modality where the host governments in these countries are really paying for the outcome. So that's the implication also to this public finance, but that takes a bit of a time to build this evidence and build these experiences in these countries. So as I said, I'm sure you all want to hear more about the Armenia Impact Bond. So I will now hand over to my colleague Vahagan to talk about that flagship project. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for all finding time to hear our pitches and presentations. So as Eva suggested, I'll start with a bit of personal experience because I think this is important. As Lina mentioned, the localization is a key factor. And when I joined the UNDP in 2018 with the background in project financing, private equity, so I have some understanding about different innovative financing mechanisms, but impact bonds was kind of new thing for me. And thanks to Alina, at that time we have two options and two preliminary feasibility studies. One was related to education and another to agriculture. So having more knowledge and having more interactions with Alina, we decided to continue with agriculture because this is very important to have the understandable and measurable outcomes in order to start building an impact bond structure on feasibility studies. Of course, education is also important, but for a country which is starting the first bond in the region, we decided to go one with the area which is more crucial for the country's development, and social problems are more kind of underlined in this sector. And what I decided to do, first of all, I understood that this is kind of a complex mechanism, but you should try to explain and pitch this to different stakeholders in order to bring them together and bond them together in order to achieve some valuable and measurable goals. And what I started to do, I started to pitch to my colleagues in UNDP from different departments, from socio-economic department, the environmental department, and I call it like a 1-minute pitch on SIP. Of course, this is not enough, but at least as a result, we've got some initial financing from EU, from Impact project. And based on this funding, we hired local and international specialists, including specialists from Citra, from Finnish Innovation Fund. We hired Peter from Australia, who had experience with the Indian employment bond. And also it gave us an opportunity also to start working with the government. And thanks to Slovak government financing, we invited one of the Vice Minister of Agriculture into the conference and seminar mentioned by Alina. And as a result, we start exploring the possible mechanism of implementation. I'll talk about that later. Can we go to the next slide? As I said, we decided to continue with the agricultural sector, and Armenia is a small country with around 3 million population, with GDP around $12 billion, and around 20% of this GDP is created in agricultural sector. But in parallel, you see that the poverty level is high, especially in one of the regions of Armenia, the Shirak region. And this region is specialized in milk farming and milk production, responsible for more than 30% of the milk supply for the country. The population is only around 9% of the country, but interestingly, most of the inhabitants of this region, they are engaged in milk farming. Of course, in different scale, at a small dairy farming, but they just satisfy the need of their families, but also the middle kind of sector, which are trying to supply to the milk processing companies, basically cheese producers and others. So you see from the graph that during last years, you can mention the decreasing number of heads. And just for your understanding, we have got around $1.5 billion private transfers from different countries, basically from Russia and from US. And whenever the economic condition is bad, and in case of milk farming in small dairy farms, when the price of feed goes up, they are just, most of them, or the part of them, they're just slaughtering their cows, buy the ticket and flight to, let's say, to Russia in order to find the work and to kind of work in other sectors with agriculture. So we try to find out those problems which actually push them to do this action, and we start to understand basically the breed, right? The capacity of the breed they have and why this is very crucial, right? It means what the break-even point is in the age, and whenever this is kind of shifted towards the higher higher OPEX, they decided what to do with their small farms. So can you go to the next slide, please? And so you see the Caucasian brown. This is the most popular breed in Shirak region and in Armenia. Starting from the Soviet period, actually most of the farms are kindly grow this breed. Of course, the breed's capacity is high, but as, considering what there are not much done on the improvement of the breed quality. Now, out of, I say, 4,000 liter of milks, which could be produced out of this Caucasian brown, mostly in average, farms are producing around 2,000. So it's really very, very kind of dangerous level of production, because you are in, as I said, they are in the age, and in case if some prices goes up or the productivity of goes down, they need to decide what to do. And this is directly affected their capacity to generate income, and also the quality of milk they are using for their families need to be improved, because we targeted basically two directions. One is the quality and the other is quantity. So if we are talking about the quality, and we brainstorm a lot with Alina, with Armen Harutyunyan, who is currently leading the Eurasian agriculture sector, and he also we also hire him as a lead of the agricultural team in Armenia. We start brainstorming about this quality and quantity outcome metrics, which is very, very important. And we arrived with the fat content is important, the protein content, and somatic cells. Fat content is important because those who are producing cheese with the export potential, they are looking for fat and they're looking for protein. And we can immediately improve the fat content by interaction in the welfare of cows, also on the feeding conditions and on the kind of mixing the different kind of feeds in order to allow this improvement. But with protein, we need the long-term interactions, because you need to change the breed or improve the breed. Also trying to bring new kind of new breeds from Europe that took time, of course. Next slide, please. And here we found some rationale to continue the work with an impact bond on agriculture sector, because we saw there was a lot of alignment with the SDGs we are pursuing with the UNDP globally, and there are clear paths how we can achieve them. And we had a lot of consultations with the local agricultural specialists. And as I said, impact bonds for me is an interaction, is a communication with different stakeholders. And you need to try to a bit adjust your pitch if you are talking with the governmental official, if you are talking with the villager, if you are talking with the milk processing company. Of course, the content, the kind of the essence is the same, but you need to allow them to understand how they can benefit out of this mechanism. But at the end of the day, what will be their role? Also, I'm talking about the UNDP itself, about the different donors, what they will be their play, how you are going to, report the impact, how you're going to measure the impact. So in case of dairy farms, it's more or less, we'll try to find the most straightforward outcomes, which is the quality, as I said, and the quantity, of course. And now we are working together with the social finance, Ecorus, and EV Consulting to identify those kind of outcomes and those aims which we are going to achieve in order to make this business sustainable for small farms, make this business profitable, and as a result, the product eventually produced should have the demand in the market. So basically, you can invest a lot of money, you can have at the end of the day like high quality milk, but the price will be so high that you cannot allow the demand from the other side, from the processor side. So next slide, please. Here you see, as I mentioned, we need to pursue different goals, short-term goals, medium-term goals and long-term goals. So here you can see those goals we are targeting and putting in the center of this mechanism. And of course, the yield is important for smallholder farms. This could be achieved in like 1 year or 1.5 years. But if we are talking about the protein level, we need to have longer term. And of course, we need to look at the welfare of cows and conditions they're keeping the cows. And most of them, they need additional education in order to understand how they can blend different feeds and how they, as a result, they can achieve the better yield and higher quality of milk. So here you can see the main outcome metrics, and later we'll show how this will evolve eventually, graduate into the theory of change, so-called. And if you can see from the next slide, we start adjusting the theory of change we developed together with our team. As I said, we have people from Citra, from different international organizations, and also locals, lawyers, we have data specialists and others. So if we turn to the next slide, you can see the theory of change. So this is kind of the way you can arrive to the final income and income for the farmers and the welfare of cows, and as a result you can have the measurable impact on the decreasing of the poverty level, and also increase in the relationship, the understandable relationship together with between contractors and meat providers. So here you can see what, together with social finance, we decided to have the 4 dimensions, which are basically, you can see in the input dimension. So we are going to concentrate on operations of infrastructure, on animal welfare, and also on market mechanism. And we believe that as a result, we will achieve to the tangible results. And last slide, please. And you can see how kind of this evolve to the final SIP structure, which consider all these challenges of farmers, all these mechanisms for achieving outcomes, all these mechanisms to achieving sustainable results and income for the farmers. So here you can see these 4 facilities. And now we are looking for partners which can contribute to all these 4 facilities. So infrastructure, animal welfare, operational facilities, and actually linkages. And here you can, as our colleagues provide a lot of insights about how it works. So you can see in the case of Armenian dairy SIP, the location, all this kind of puzzle in the structure. And you can see the impact investor. We are looking for the outcome payer and the verification agency, target population, and the founders. So happy to reflect your questions. Of course, it's kind of a bit complicated mechanism, but if you can divide it into the different sectors and different dimensions and try to pitch it and try to communicate with all stakeholders using their own vocabulary, you will finally achieve to some structure and eventually to implementation of this project.
Thank you very much, Vagan, to really like describe the whole environment. And I feel, like this is like an excellent that we have a theory and right now a practice, and I feel like everyone right now can understand how impact bond works. And to make the things a little bit challenging, we will right now, because we are mostly speaking about impact bonds, we will now focus on different instrument, which is developed by Rules of Impact. And I'm right now handing over to Patrizia Baffioni, and over to you, dear, to share the experience with this time related also and premium payments for reaching out the goals. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good morning, everyone. Dzień dobry wszystkim. I'm so happy that there are some Polish people in the room. It's very rare for me to present also to a Polish audience. I will share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it.
It's brilliant, thank you.
So today I would like to talk about social impact incentives, which is a pay-for-success model, fairly similar and aligned with many of the things that you have heard about impact bonds, but it also presents certain differences. This model was developed by Roots of Impact, which is an advisory firm focused on creating effective solutions for financing impact at scale. And our considerations are really the starting point of reflecting on what can be done to really bring the most effective type of finance to impact enterprises was the fact that we noticed that the vast majority of impact enterprises that were serving the bottom of the pyramid and working with the most vulnerable groups, apart from having in common this very impactful goal, they were really struggling to operate at scale, and many of them are not ready to take on investment. And so if you look at the other side of the coin, what is happening in the investment space, we also notice that there are many impact investors that are not necessarily willing to sacrifice financial returns in order to see higher levels of impact. And in fact, there is only a small proportion of investors who would forego their returns to rather focus on impact. And so we really see that there is a so-called commercial viability gap for impact enterprises, which means that an enterprise is creating some sort of financial value, generating revenues out of its activities, and at the same time is creating a lot of social value that unfortunately is not fully captured in market prices. So of course, if you're selling to low-income populations, you cannot make the same margins that a traditional business would do, who is, for example, targeting more middle or high-income populations. And so out of this consideration, we really try to ask ourselves the question, what would happen if social returns really mattered for businesses? And so what if we could, in a way, quantify and monetize this impact that these enterprises are creating and give it back to them in order to say, this is the full value you're creating and you should be able to benefit from it. And this is really how we came up with social impact incentives, or SINC, as a mechanism really to help enterprises overcome tensions between their commercial and impact goals. And so by raising investment and scaling, they can then take advantage of economies of scale and simply be able to then deliver that same impact or even greater impact in the future. And so the way one can think of it is really looking at the financial cash flows of an enterprise that, in the case of these enterprises, are just about covering their running costs. When you provide that additional portion, that additional revenue stream, which is linked to outcomes, this will improve the overall profitability of this enterprise. And it will also decrease its risk return profile for an investor who is now more interested in investing in the company and also is expecting that this company will yield him a return. Let's look at a concrete example just to make things a little bit more hands-on. We recently signed a SINC with a company based in Cambodia operating in the water and sanitation space. So the problem in Cambodia is that 3 million people currently lack access to safe water, and 77% of the population live in rural areas, and these are typically more difficult to reach areas when it comes to pipe water supply. And when water was privatized in Cambodia, a lot of private water operators emerged. However, they are not particularly effective. They didn't have the right type of expertise. So in certain areas, these operations are not run so effectively. And at the same time, there is almost 1.7 million households who are in areas which are not commercially viable for piped water. So here we really see the market failure. It's just not possible to provide access to safe piped water to these people. And so what the company we are working with, Khmer Water Supply Holding, does is to acquire those private rural water stations and then basically upgrade them in order to make them more efficient, and at the same time expanding the pipeline coverage, reaching really this last mile, if you want to call it this way. And so what we have seen is that the enterprise, was able to expand their coverage up to a certain point. And then even for them, it just wasn't commercially viable to reach this last mile. And also when it came to taking decisions on which stations to acquire, they would try to look at certain criteria and go for areas or stations that were simply easier for them to expand rapidly and then start generating revenues. And so the focus of the sync, where we saw we could really add value, was twofold. On one hand, expand to the most difficult to reach areas, and at the same time, influence the decision criteria for future expansions to ensure that what K-WASH was able to do would also apply in those, what they were considered more difficult conditions. And so we developed a metric system really targeting these two aspects, and with the ultimate goal really to make the impact orientation of the company more explicit and to focus on additionality, so what wouldn't have happened otherwise, using strong proxies. So for instance, what we have seen is that connecting the poorest of the poor in rural Cambodia, if it was subsidized, actually, because the company already had run a similar pilot in the past, these poorest of the poor would still be able to pay for ongoing access to water, but really the biggest hurdle was this initial connection. And so we see through these proxies that those outcomes, which is giving access to safe water, are really achievable. I'm sorry. Okay, I'll continue. So we have closed a number of transactions over the past 5 years, and we have also several ones in preparation across many different sectors. So from healthcare to employment and education, as well as agriculture. And just to give a little bit more of detail around how this works, the structure is pretty simple and straightforward. We partner up with outcome payers, so public funders who are willing to pay for social outcomes. And it's really a bilateral contract between the impact enterprise and the outcome payer. So the impact enterprise is always the actor that is receiving the value that they generate. It's very important for us to make sure that since they are the ones taking the risk, they're also the ones who should receive the reward for it. And at the same time, we are looking at enterprises that are raising investment to scale. And so there is a second contract, if you want, in place between the enterprise and the investor. and we do not have any predefined investor, and also all forms of repayable investment are fine for us, because we really think that the enterprise should be able to choose whatever investor suits them best, and it's most aligned also with what they're looking for. And of course, the outcomes are regularly verified by a verifier, which then confirms that a certain performance took place. And so this is when the outcome payer pays out the incentives. Talking about suitability criteria for a sync, what we have seen being really important for us is working with enterprises that show a strong evidence for positive impact on disadvantaged target groups. Also, we focus on enterprises that are scalable and also have potential for commercial self-sustainability. We want their impact to continue also after the sync ends. And so it can be either a private exit if you want, so the company becoming commercial, and so being able to continue sustainably operating, or it could also rely on public contracting if that is the case or the preference. We look at directed and measurable outcomes or proxies. Attribution here is really key to understand which one suits best, and also data availability, of course. And finally, we really want to address the market failures where we see that, you know, enterprises just cannot do that extra impact part because they also have limits when it comes to self-sustainability. And so we really want them to overcome this tension between commercial and impact goals. We are often asked, what is the difference between sync and a social impact bond? So I may, you know, take it for the Q&A, because where I really wanted to focus on is what we have learned in the past 5 years since we started piloting sync. And by the way, our first program was developed together with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, with whom we are still working. And it has been a very strong and very, I would say, long-term collaboration. So what we have learned is really that in order to prepare enterprises for sync and other outcome-based instruments, they really need a good impact measurement and management practice because data are key. And we always really have this co-creation approach with the enterprises to understand where they stand, what they want and can achieve. And so this is how the incentive schemes are created. We have seen that having sector-specific programs allows us better to compare the different solutions, and also it allows to create substantial efficiencies throughout the whole process. So we are becoming faster and better at it. And we know that also technology will be even more important for achieving these efficiencies when it comes to smart contracting and just using available data to be able to better and faster structure those transactions. And what is really key for us, and I keep on like highlighting it, is really to understand where is the additionality. What are we trying to incentivize the company to do that it wouldn't do otherwise? And last but not least, Sync, which was our first solution back 5 years ago, is only one tool of what we call impact-linked finance, which really pursues the objectives of ensuring that enterprises receive better terms for better impact. And so with this, I'm going to conclude and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation and, for really showing us what Roots of Impact are doing and giving us very vivid examples. And, you know, as we are meeting online and because of the COVID-19 and because one of these questions already pop up into the chat, I would like to ask about the impact of the pandemic of doing these particular tools. And let's localize this question. So I would like to ask Alina or Wahagan, you know, speaking about you, what really the pandemic changed in the way of doing the things?
The first problem arrived after that is the site visits, because definitely you need to do site visits to go to see the milk farmers and have this evidence. And based on that, you are going to structure whatever you're going to do with them, because they are a part of this. You cannot avoid you know, this communication with them. So, but we'll try now. In Armenia, it's more or less settled, and we are traveling in regions. So now the problem is solved. But from the beginning, when social finance joined the initiative, we had chance to visit like 1 year ago, and it makes some problems. That's the main kind of the problem, I think.
Yeah, great. And you know, like in general, if I may ask, you know, speaking about the farmers as a locals and the way of engaging them, do you see there any kind of different way how to work and how to engage these groups into the project, speaking, you know, the difference between the social impact bonds and so-called traditional methods?
You know, there is a big problem of data in countries like Armenia, especially in regions. And also, if you go directly to farmers and start pitching social impact bonds, you can imagine the reaction, right? But we decided to go to processors who knows farmers who are like buying this milk for years and years, and they have their own database. So that was our solution of this problem. So we had kind of the database we can analyze to understand with whom it's more efficient to work with, who is more sensitive to trainings and to other interventions the service provider is going to do. And from other sides, you will have some side view to understand what's going on and what is the reaction of the farmers to different trainings, mechanisms, and interventions, and try to build your further activities on that.
Okay, thank you. And, you know, I will stay with still practical terms, and I will ask Toby or Peter, you know, to answer here, because we have questions from the participants speaking about the practical way of dealing with the things, how to do the mitigation of risks, and how to really, like, speaking about the time, you know, what is also here the difference to so-called traditional, you know, methods and proceedings.
Can I have a go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So on COVID, I think you know, just following on from Van's piece, clearly not being able to go and do work in country has been critical in terms of understanding, you know, certainly the performance management of impact bonds, understanding, if you like, it's hard to do adaptation if you can't go in the field in some ways. On the other hand, it's pushed us into finding other routes to get data and have conversations. So that's the first element, is doing the performance management and working. The other has been that for some work, some impact bonds, it's meant that the measurement has been difficult, where they've been reliant on, for example, survey data or school visits or similar. Then it's become difficult to implement that measurement. And therefore, we have found, generally speaking, that parties have been good at getting around the table and talking about alternative solutions, or there have, in some instances, been delays where it's just not been possible to reach conclusions. So I think those have been the critical pieces, as well as obviously everyone being very focused on, you know, a number of agencies we deal with being very focused on COVID rather than other things. So that's been, I think, the third element. There were a couple of pieces in the chat, as you mentioned, one around time and how long things take. So the reason for the investment piece, when results are achieved, clearly it's critical that we build out a results model, an understanding of concrete outputs that can be paid for and concrete outcomes which are typically arriving later and require a more complex measurement. And we try to arrange an impact bond to have a mix of those measures so that some money comes in earlier to, for example, start to pay for the continuation of the program. And then the outcomes funding at the end comes in as an additional incentive for to pay. So it's a careful balancing act in terms of often a mix of outputs and outcomes to achieve a reasonable financing model. If you just waited for outcomes that are going to be measured in 7 years' time, no one's going to be paid anything in the meantime, then you end up with too much leakage in terms of so the proportion of the funding that's going for the program versus repaying investors for the risk they're taking, that's no longer in balance. So we work quite hard to have the right mix so that you end up with, say, 10-20% of the outcome funding going to investor returns rather than to represent the risk rather than the project itself.
Just to add on the way that the sequencing of financial flows works, the investors will put all the money up front, and the investors will finance the service providers, say providers of agricultural support, dairy support to farmers in Armenia. And the outcome funders, the grant funders at the end of the process will then, as Toby is saying, repay the investors as and when the outputs and the outcomes are achieved. But from the point of view of the service providers, the people working with the dairy farmers, they are paid in the normal way that they would be under any project. They're not sitting around waiting for results to be achieved and putting their own capital at risk. There are incentives for them, but they're not risking going bankrupt if their payments come too late to save them from a cash flow crisis. They're getting paid in the normal way as they would in any project.
Yeah, thank you for this overview. And Patricia, is this somehow, the process different speaking about SINS?
So definitely this bit is different. We pay the enterprise upon the achievement of the results. So usually we measure the results every 6 or 12 months. And this is where we believe that it's, I think it's really a different approach or a different thinking. Like if you want the enterprise to reach an extra mile, you need to give them the incentive to do so, because if they are paid anyways, whether they achieve or not the outcomes, how can they be willing to do more than what they're asked? So this is at least where we take the stand of saying that all the value that is being created should go directly to the enterprise. And at the same time, the investor is also benefiting indirectly. So they, of course, want the enterprise to succeed, because if the enterprise reaches the results, it gets paid, and then the investor in turn will see also their own revenues or returns coming back.
Yeah. Thank you. And, seeing also this, from the point of investors, and, another question we have in our chat, what is the motivation behind, like the investors, are engaged? And if you could take over also and continue here, Patricia, to give us example.
So investors are typically interested in the enterprise itself. So again, it's a very enterprise-centric approach. It's the enterprise's job to seek for investors for scaling. And what we are offering with the sync is, promising an additional revenue stream over a certain period of time if the enterprise reaches certain results. And so when we've been talking with the enterprises to understand also, you know, whether the investors have any reaction, it is, the vast majority is actually very, very happy about it, right? Because this means, okay, so my enterprise is going to earn money for something that they're usually not paid for. So it's going to be more profitable, and then my returns are more likely to come. And also what happens as well is that we do have some cases where the enterprise is really struggling attracting investment. And this is indeed an additional reason for the investor to join in, because they see this promise.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I see that Peter unmuted himself. So maybe you would like to say also here something, speaking about the investors and their background.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in our experience with the impact bonds that we've worked on, we've seen a mix of investors. Almost all of them have a social motivation, a double or triple line motivation, but they're quite varied. Some of them are major multilaterals like EBRD. Some of them are bilaterals, and some of them are philanthropic foundations, sometimes wanting to put their endowment capital to more socially rewarding use and potentially a higher financial return as well. But the major incentive is the social return that they're getting both on their endowment and on their endowment income. So there's quite a broad range of investors. And I think in general, in our impact bonds, we've found the investment side to be easier than the grant financing outcome funding side. In several of our bonds, we've been oversubscribed, for example, in the Palestine bond, which is not obviously an easy environment for investors. We were oversubscribed on that with 5 interested investors. So contrary to perhaps what we feared at the beginning, it has been possible to get investors into what might be regarded as risky environments like the West Bank and Gaza. And that's been a sort of pleasant surprise, I think, for us in terms of both the quantity of interested capital and their willingness to take what maybe others would see as a relatively high risk.
Thank you. And you have mentioned that you have found a difference to the crowdfunding. Could you just, deep dive into this? Like, what makes the difference? And you are muted.
The difference is that there's a much larger availability of, as it were, spare impact capital. There's just a very large amount of social capital out there looking for worthwhile investments. Grant funding for outcomes is very constrained. There is enormous demands on it, particularly now with COVID, with large amounts of spending going towards both direct health expenditures for vaccine distribution, support for health services, and so on, but also for many of the donors to broader economic support as economies contract from the indirect economics effects of COVID. So I think mostly it's a question of how much, as it were, discretionary spending there is available, which is limited in the case of outcome funders, more available in the case of investors. However, what we are seeing is increasingly outcome funders seeing this not as something that's additional to their existing programs, but something that's a better way of using their existing funding. So quite a lot of funders are now thinking about using funding that would otherwise have gone for traditional project approaches to using an impact bond model instead. And that has made our work, to be honest, quite a lot easier over the last few years, because we're not trying to present ourselves as some risky pilot that can be used with a bit of discretionary funding, but as something that's a core way of better delivering what donors want to do in terms of their development objectives.
Yeah. Thank you for this, the description and point, because I can say, like speaking about the pandemics, like we can speak really for a long time what it really brings not only to our lives, but really, the way we are working. And many thanks to all of you presenting the social, this impact financing into the deep. And I hope your projects will continue well, and that one day we will meet in person and discuss the details. And I would like to also say a special thanks to Slovakia for the lead on today's webinar, and also for partnering with UNDP to pilot, different mechanisms. And many thanks also to all the participants, to the questions, and please do not forget to join us for the next webinar, which will be organized with the lead of Poland. We'll meet on June 9, and we will discuss the way how is innovation promoted in development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. So again, many thanks to all of you, many thanks to our dear speakers, and see you in 2 weeks. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.